So we come to our third, maybe we've saved the best till last, keynote speaker for BIRA Annual Conference 2022. And I'm delighted that Lucian is able to join us. Lucian is Professor of Educational Policy and Research at the University of Bucharest. And we're just delighted he's come from Romania to speak to us. We're really delighted about that. His main areas of research are related to, but not limited to, the public educational policy process, the application of neurocognitive and cognitive sciences in public policies and learning processes. And he's in high demand both in Romania and across Europe and beyond for his expertise. So he's also president of our sister organisation, the Romanian Association of Educational Research, representing them on ERA Council, where I know him from. He's also a member of the General Assembly of the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement. So we're delighted that he's been able to join us, and I'd like now to ask him to address us. And there will be some time for questions at the end, so do think of some as Lucian is speaking to us. Lucian.
Thank you very much, Myri. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's fantastic to be here. I was so happy and enthusiastic when I received the invitation to deliver this keynote, so I decided to conduct myself accordingly. So here I am in front of you using the BIRA 22 colors and the appropriate color jacket. I think that, as you were, I was also fascinated by the works of the conference so far, and I was particularly fascinated by the dialogue of Rachel and David yesterday. But since I have no Rachel to ask me the questions, I'm going to ask the questions myself, as you can already see from the title of my presentation. So, what am I going to talk about in this conversation? I'm going to give you some milestones now, not the whole structure of the presentation, and we will unveil together the more concrete elements of the discussion as we go. So, first of all, few elements of context, 30 years after and looking ahead. A general context of decision and policy making in Central and Eastern Europe, because the whole discussion that I'm going to have today with you is going to bring the flavor of what is going on in that part of the world. Then we will move to another question that I'm asking myself, and I'm asking here you after you will see the elements of what is going on. Is it the policy-making process improvisation or professionalism in Central and Eastern Europe? Is there a process perspective that we can take, and can we answer this rhetoric question in a way? And then, in the end, we will look a little bit to how policy-making works or sometimes does not work in Central and Eastern Europe. And, of course, we will try to find some answers to the question what we can do about it, how it can be improved. Of course, that I'm taking this stereotype of giving some context. Everyone does that when they start presentations. I promise that I'm not going into the conceptual debate and spend 95% of my time with the context issues. I think that the best way to get you a little bit into the context, it came to my mind today when I was traveling to this conference place and I was seeing kids going to school. This is beginning of the school year. Kids are going back to school in Europe and beyond. And this is very important after this crisis, that they are literally going back to school. On a more historical note, about 36 years ago, at this time I was also going to my first day of school in lower secondary education. During those times, in the communist Romania, we wouldn't necessarily start immediately the teaching and learning when we were going to school. But in my small village in central southeastern part of Romania, like thousands of other kids in Romania and in communist countries, we would start with what was called agricultural practice. So basically what we would do, we would go for, depending on the weather, a couple of weeks or even more to do agricultural work in communist collective farms. Sometimes it was fun when we were going to pick up plums or grapes. Sometimes it was not that fun when we were picking potatoes or corn. But we were spending the first days of schooling not in the school learning, but in the field working, starting with about the age of 12, contributing to the so-called autumn agricultural campaign. And then we would eventually start teaching and learning, sometimes in simultaneous classes. I did my second degree, second class together with the kids on the fourth class. We were frequently put it together, especially in rural areas, because short number of kids, because not so many qualified teachers available. But then we would finally start teaching and learning, but in the same time we were doing other weird things for schooling, like we were raising silk bugs. We had to do that. It was an obligation of schools to deliver that. We would collect medicinal plants. We would attend a lot of, communist celebrations, and we were wearing very ugly and uncomfortable uniforms, having registration numbers on our coats, like in prison. But yes, we would have 2 hours of national TV per day, out of which, of course, 1 hour and 45, there were news about the achievements of the communist regime. So not very entertaining. But we would have 10 minutes of cartoons on Saturdays. So, this was the general context, if you wish. But looking a little bit to the Central and Eastern Europe, even geographically, there is a debate what is Central and Eastern Europe. I'm not going to get into that debate. I'm referring mainly to those countries who, after a while, entered to the European Union, but I'm not excluding from my reflection Ukraine and Moldova on the one hand, in the eastern part, and I'm not excluding also the Western Balkans, the former Yugoslavia and Albania. So, if you wish, more than 30 years after the post-communist reconstruction of social and cultural life, large-scale reforms everywhere, decision-making system reforms in general, but education in particular, we are having a new political and social situation in Central and Eastern Europe. Large part of those countries are members of the European Union and other international democratic networks. We are having freedom. We have, more important, we have now, as we speak, the first generation taking the lead in different sectors, the first generation which is free of communism. So those guys having 30 years, about 30 years now, who didn't live any year of the communist times. So it's just nowadays that it happens. And I think that it should be acknowledged as part of the general context. Majority of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe are still struggling with different kinds of transition, although some scientists said that transition paradigm is over. It's not over. There is economic fragility, there are challenges to the rule of law, there is immigration, and now the war at the borders in Ukraine. And, we were all hit by the COVID crisis everywhere. We are definitely all struck by the war in Ukraine, but trust me, it's a bit different when you can hear it from your home or now from your school in some parts of the country. And, in particular, there is a growing worrying attitude, especially in Romania, because we had a particularity, unfortunately, compared with the other countries. The fall of communism in Romania was the most violent from all Central and Eastern European countries, so we didn't have the Velvet Revolution in December '89. As you can see in some pictures here. I'm not going to insist on these pictures, just to give you a hint. What I'm trying to say here, it is that when we analyze the situation in general, but in particular the policymaking situation in Central and Eastern Europe, we have to acknowledge that there is still a legacy there. Central and East European education systems share some features that are the legacy of the structures established during the 50s following the Soviet examples. And you can still trace that. You can still trace that in spite of all transformation that we had. You can trace it in the mindsets of policymakers, in the behavior of teachers and parents, and also in the institutional setups, and sometimes in the daily practice of these systems. Is this legacy there? And again, I think that we have just to acknowledge it. Now, a little bit more particular context of policymaking. I'm going to get back to this idea, but we are facing the born of a new type of authoritarianism in Central and Eastern Europe, and I would say even beyond. But there is this legacy in Central and Eastern Europe that I think it makes this phenomenon particularly worrying. And as a consequence of this authoritarianism, that you can see it, even in the more developed countries like Hungary, but also in Serbia, you can see it in Kosovo, you can see it all over. And this new type of authoritarianism bring an atrophy of the backbones of public policy, which are consultation, debate, choice, ownership, subsidiarity. Basically, in my opinion, we are assisting to a kind of rebuilding of a facade democracy that articulates, using as a pretext the current crisis, actually. We have to do this, we have to do that because there is COVID, because there is war, because there is economic turmoil, and it allows decision makers to go the short way and alter the very concept of the idea of public policy. In larger part of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, we are having over-regulated system. There ought to be a law. Law is a power tool. I said a power tool, not a powerful tool. It's a power tool that sets boundaries. We are assisting in a way to a naive overuse and many times abuse of these regulatory tools in Central and Eastern Europe. And the dominance of this kind of tools says something. We persist. And I'll give you an example of this naive obsession with regulatory tools. In Romania, I think that we have one of the toughest road safety laws in Europe, and at the same time we have the highest number of casualties on the road in Europe. But people still believe that they have to fix the country by issuing laws, and the result is over-regulated system, heavy systems with many laws bumping into each other and not producing, not delivering results. Why? Because we're in a vicious circle of structures, how I call it. What does it mean? It means prevalence of structural approaches and without looking carefully into the processes. It is the glass bead game, how Herman Hesse calls it, with permanent institutional rearrangements, modification of the surface factors and conditions, and so on and so forth. So we are in this stage of looking too much to the structures and neglecting quality of the processes. In the beginning of the conversation, I asked this question: is it improvisation or professionalism? And taking a process perspective, trying to answer this question. So basically, what does it mean, professionalism? When can we say about a central governance that it behaves in a professional way? We have these three authors here, all of them from Central and Eastern Europe, who made a great analysis years ago. And they say that strategic policymaking is present when three types of goals are achieved. Produce policy that bring collective benefits, that are sustainable on a long-term perspective, and maximize gains while minimizing loss to their addressees. Is it the case in Central and Eastern Europe? You don't need very deep research to answer the question that is not really the case. So it's rather improvisation, the process of policymaking there. And I'm going to bring 5 arguments in favor of this sentence. First of all, there is an obsession for structures, as I said. Too much focus on structures, and then shrinking space for specialized agencies, for professional agencies to act in an integrated manner and keep the very fragmented departmentalization of the central administration. Then you have weak mechanism for consultation, very poor use of the diversity of policy tools at their disposal, and then limited capacity or limited use of of research data. I will mainly focus on the last two here in the list, namely on policy tools and use of research data. We are apparently seduced by structures and neglect processes. What you see in Central and Eastern Europe, you see permanent change in the structure of the central government, in the structure of the ministry. Every time the new minister comes, the first idea, okay, let's change the structure of the ministry, let's change even the name of the ministry. We've changed 12 ministers in the last 4 years or something like that. This led to over-politicization, instability, and low effectiveness. Then they changed the structure of educational system as such, or subsystems. They are very busy with shapes. Changing the school cycles, changing the number of compulsory years of schooling, changing the coverage, introducing nursery in the schooling system, the structure of the school years. We have recently changed in Romania the structure of school years. We don't have trimesters, we don't have semesters, we have modules. We have 5 modules. So the school years is split in 5 modules. I have a 16-year-old son, and he asked me one day, after he found out about this decision, he said, it's better with modules, right? We'll have more holiday. And then I said, you know, count your number of days of holiday. And he said, wow, that's less holiday, actually. And why do we have, and he asked me this question, and I couldn't answer. And he said, why 5 and not 4? I can't answer this question. Actually, it doesn't matter if you have 2 semesters, 5 modules, or whatever. It's just structural changes. It's just scratching the iceberg on the top, how I call it, you know. A lot of structural changes that come also with structure of constituent elements of the system, but with low impact on quality of teaching and learning. How many hours per disciplines, what contents and skills in the syllabi, how should textbooks look like, when should we have and how many national assessments, how school directors could be employed. I'm not saying that this is not important. I'm saying that according to a bench of studies that we all have access to, these factors are marginal factors in influencing quality of teaching and learning. And this is why they are focused on this kind of changes, which demand a lot of effort, but provide quite poor efficiency. Then the second factor of improvising is the role of central agencies, very important in Europe. Central agencies are those professional agencies which act under the coordination of the Ministry of Education, and they are expected to take care about key aspects of the system, like teacher education, curriculum, assessments, management, quality assurance, and so on and so forth. They are present in all countries in different forms. But in Central Eastern Europe, they are very important because this is supposed to be the first professional layer of educational governance after the politicians, you know. And what happened is that these agencies are not empowered, are not stimulated to function in a professional way. And this led, of course, to instability and politicization of these agencies and further politicization of the whole system up to the school level, which is really not good, I believe. And in these agencies, which was quite powerful in the late 90s, beginning of 20s, because it was a lot of young people being willing to get involved in large-scale reforms. But now they deserted from there. And you go to these agencies and you can hardly find really professional staff working there, really people who understand what policymaking is and how it should be done. So, again, after focusing on structure, not so much capacity in the central professional agencies at the central level of educational governance. Moreover, we are assisting to a weakening of the democratic backbone of the policymaking process. You have a lot of formalism, you know. For instance, they are posting new projects or new ideas for policymaking on the website, and they said, okay, if you want, you can send us written feedback. Sometimes they do simulacral debates, mostly run ad hoc by the media, who find out about an interesting idea and then they call them. Sometimes they appeal to hilarious, but I would call it in the same time abusive approaches, like launching consultation deliberately during holidays, or consult large network of supporters. We faced this recently. In Romania, we are now about to adopt a new law of education. And they launched the consultation for this new project of law of education on the 1st of August, when everyone literally goes in holiday in Romania. That's the holiday time for teachers, for universities, for everyone. And this was the date in which they launched the public debate with the new projects. Fortunately, people felt the importance of the gesture, and they got thousands of messages, thousands of protests, thousands of reactions from the holiday, but still. Now I'm looking forward to see what is going to happen, if they will take it into account or if they will just march victoriously and say, we had a huge consultation, thousands of reactions, and they'll just go their own way, you know. This leads to pervasive mistrust between these three key parties, decision makers on the one side, and specialists, researchers, and public stakeholders on the other side, parents, business, teachers, weakening the anyway fragile democratic behavior from both sides. And this is a dangerous, vicious circle, I would say. Because what is going to happen, it is like this. When they launch public consultation, there is less reaction because researchers and the other stakeholders, they say they anyway don't take into account, so why bother? And then they launch less consultation because they say we don't get any substantive feedback anyway. And this is really dangerous, in my opinion. This is weakening the democratic behavior. It leads people live in two separate worlds where they should live in the same world and work together and be accountable for what they are doing. Now, a little bit about the policy tools. Here, I will approach 5 ideas, a little bit of context again, some premises about policy tools, 2 typologies and how they work in Central and Eastern Europe, and then a kind of conclusions, like tools, like governance. Well, the broader context, the literature says that we are assisting to an unprecedented proliferation of policy tools in the last decades. So we have more tools at our disposal to implement our policies, to be successful and effective with our interventions. And there is consistency of studies analyzing the way in which policy influence human social behavior, especially coming from this neuroscience research. So that's the broader context. And starting from here, my invitation to you, it is to analyze the following logic. That's a simple linear logic in 3 steps. First, capacity for policy making at a central governance level is visible from many perspectives, but one key perspective is the mix of policy tools they engage when designing an intervention. Second, the choice of policy tools influences the potential impact of the implementation, but is also highly influenced by the behavioral patterns of the decision makers. And as a kind of preliminary conclusion, one symptom of poor capacity for policy making could be the sporadic use of the more sophisticated policy tools, involving less exercise of power, like imposing, and more consultation, more persuasion, more expertise, more evidences, communication, bargaining and convincing. Starting from this logic, you know that we can, there are a lot of classification of policy tools or different perspectives to look at those. But in a previous work that I did with some colleagues, we tried to look, keeping in mind the logic before, we tried to look to the policy tools according to authority complexity axis. And here we have 4 quadrants, and I will just quickly go through this with some examples. In the first quadrant, you have low authority, high complexity policy tools. And here you have professional development and training programs, advocacy, communication campaigns, and so on. In the second, you have high authority, high complexity tools, like technical assistance or consultancy, targeted development programs, building new institutions. In the third quadrant, which, guess what, is the favorite quadrant of the governance in Central and Eastern Europe, high authority, low complexity, laws, regulations sometimes, some mandate, standards, working groups. And then you have low authority, low complexity, like, guidelines, public or expert debates, and so on. So, if we look to this, for me, it is very clear if I analyze the behavior of educational governance in Central and Eastern Europe, and probably not educational governance, but governance, generally speaking, they really like to stay in the third quadrant. And this is why we have over-regulated system and ineffective processes. And we touch just the tip of the iceberg. And guess what? Of course, that when decision-making rests in the third quadrant, in the slide before, guess what's the favorite locus of control for the policy tools they employ? It's, of course, very much into the bureaucracy hierarchy, central regulation. We are feeding this myth of command and control, which is part of the communist legacy, but we don't want to admit it anymore, And as I said, the last part regarding this idea of investigating a little bit the policy tools. I believe that if you really look to the policy tools the governance is using, you can say something about the quality of that governance and the behavioral patterns of the decision makers. And as Schneider and Ingram said, instruments are embodied in policies. And the ideas upon which they rest are as important as the exercise of power and the influence that produces policy. Choice of instruments is a reflection of values and beliefs of the decision makers. But it is also a reflection over time of some behavioral patterns still altering the fragile democratic practice in Central and Eastern Europe. Is the legacy of being successful against all odds. I hear decision makers saying, people in their 60s or more saying, look at me, I succeeded. Yes, but you succeeded against the system. How would you succeed if the system would support you? I could say about myself that I succeeded as well against the system. But we don't have to put our kids in this situation again. We don't have to give them our example. We managed. We did it, They don't have to do it in the same way. We are living in a slightly different world, I hope. Okay, I'm moving now to the research evidence. So we went through 4 facets of improvisation in central government. Focus on structures, weak activity of professional agency, weak mechanisms of consultation and debate, and poor use of sophisticated policy tools, preference for the third quadrant. Now, let's look a little bit to the use of research evidence. Here, I'm trying to bring some ideas about this way from knowledge or science to decision-making. It's not an easy road. Sometimes it's really a slippery slope. Few words about bounded rationality and few ideas about revisiting evidence-based policy making. All right, so in spite of all recent criticism of the evidence-based policy making, which we can all find in the literature, I believe, together with Blockstein, that science has much to offer to the political process, including specialized expert knowledge, critical thinking, objectivity, data and informed interpretations, credibility, and so on. Again, I understand criticism, and this is why I'll refer later to revisiting a little bit the paradigm of evidence-based policy making, but we as scientists, we don't have to lose hope that we can influence decision making. But we have to understand that this road is not a one-way road. What I'm saying here is not enough to publish a paper and then say it's responsibility of others to take results of our research and do something with it to inform decisions. It's a two-way process. It's a two-way process because we have to admit, as Karen said, that policy, it's an indispensable instrument for converting new knowledge into better lives and better futures. Of course, we do sometimes research for the sake of research. We try to improve knowledge, to become wiser. But especially in social sciences, and we are here in the room researchers in education. Research is socially engaged. It has to lead, in a way or another, to better lives and to better futures. But it has to be sometimes, this knowledge, it has to be converted to become policy relevant. It's not always policy relevant per se. I was assisting yesterday to the presentation on the status of the discipline. Extraordinary, very interesting. But imagine policymaker reading that kind of reports. You know how they say that policymakers like to read, but they hate to turn the page. Then, of course, that we have to acknowledge that policymakers should have conviction and capacity to operate in a knowledge-based approach, which is not always the case. It is not always the case because they are facing this bounded rationality. Schaeffer said that policymakers ignore most issues in the absence of a major event. So something bad has to happen in order to give attention to an issue. Then they react. This is how they do policymaking, reacting to something bad that happened. All policymakers face this bounded rationality, as Kearney said. He's a researcher from here, from the UK. And policymakers engage in a policymaking environment over which they have very limited knowledge and minimal control. But what they have and what they hold, it is this their own uncontested truths, you know. They know better. And these uncontested truths, they are based on discretionary authority they have sometimes, and lack of mechanisms for accountability, which allows this discretionary authority. Based on the narratives of power and responsibility, they have to take credit and advantage. They have to go in front of the electors and say something nice to be re-elected, you know. They need job next year as well. And these truths are also based on a limited capacity to meaningfully engage with evidences. And, you know, basically you have power, you have to show results, and you have limited competence. That's the situation in which you find central governance of education many times. And to complicate things even more, there is an elephant in the room, how somebody said yesterday here. And this is very nicely put it by Lakoff in his book, Don't Think of an Elephant. He warned us that people think in frames. We as scientists, sometimes we strongly believe that the truth will set us free, that we discover truth and then it is the obligation of all the others to take account of that truth and to use it, to use the science to improve the world, to make people's life better. But, because there is a but, to be accepted, the truth must fit people's frames. If facts do not fit the frame stays and the facts bounce. Here, I think that we should start about meeting scientists and decision makers somewhere in the middle. It is about the science of framing. Framing doesn't mean to give up the truth. Framing means to allow the truth to be converted and to fit as much as possible the frames of mind of the decision makers so that they can accept it, but also of the addressees, of the people, so that they can accept the change. Nobody is taking the truth for granted. Okay. We also have to be realistic and not oversimplify reality. Claiming that one factor should be the only factor in public policy because it's our factor, you know, science, data, evidence. This is what we produce. It is an oversimplification from our side this time, and it is not a right one. EBPM became lately a myth to be served to the authoritarian non-professional regimes. You know, shouting at them, you are not working right, you should work evidence-based. And this evidence-based is a new type of myth. If you take it as such, and if you take it out from the context, then you don't get the expected results. And we have to remember, when using evidence, that quality and role of evidence is also contested. And we are all producing this evidence. And now, okay, let's do this. How many of you, and please hands up, how many of you contributed to a policy-oriented research, producing policy-relevant data. So how many of you were involved in research that you consider it was policy-relevant? Hands up. Wow, thank you very much. I expected that. Now, how many of you have been directly engaged in developing a policy paper? How many of you were directly engaged in writing to a policy paper? You can look around. Less than half. Much less than half. And last question, how many of you have been involved in policy communication activities, in advocacy, in trying to convert results of research for the broad understanding of the policymakers or of the public? How many of you? A little bit better. Thank you very much. So it is this process that we lose interest and courage, or both, to get involved in producing policy-relevant things because they don't like it, they don't get it, it's not our job, and so on and so forth. We have to acknowledge from both or from all sides the complexity of the process, that public issues landscape is fragmented, sometimes incoherent and contradictory. And yes, we have to admit that governments, leaderships, usually do not spontaneously invite innovative advice from the research community. They don't really like us, don't they? Now, in the last part of my conversation, an analysis of how it works or it doesn't work, the whole process in Central and Eastern Europe. Now back to the basic. What do we want to achieve as scientists, as analysts? We want to go through this process of inform, persuade, and eventually move to action. If our research would reach the top level, then we would be happy. We would achieve success. But sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't happen. I would like you to really acknowledge the whole complexity of the process. I was focusing on the process today from this triangle, but you also have elements in the other sides of a policy project. There are the perspectives on public policy. How do you define public policy? I didn't went into definitions today, but it's important, understanding of public policy. In Romanian language, we don't have the word policy. In none of the languages of Central and Eastern Europe, there is no word policy. You have politics and policy. We use different kind of expressions to denominate public policy and to differentiate it from politics. So perspectives are important. And also those pervasive networks of policy actors, policy networks, very important as well. I didn't address those two today, but they are there. But you know, when we look to the process, we all like this ideal case scenario, the policy cycle. If you Google policy cycle, you can find hundreds of examples of policy cycles, more or less looking the same because they go into stages. It looks nice, right? It would be nice to do policy this way, but reality, it's messier, and the alternative was the garbage can approach to public policy. I didn't put a garbage can here on my slides, but let's see how it works in Central and Eastern Europe. It works like this. It gets the circle into a line. This is how the governance works in our countries. We transform a process in a simple line, and I know that the policy cycle is a rational and sometimes impossible process to respect as such. But I believe that it is a rational approach that we should take into account and avoid doing this line and saying, you know, policy cycle is not possible anyway because we have no time. So we take out this democratic backbone of public policy process, which is about consultation, debate, deliberation, participation, and so on and so forth. As soon as a problem reached the agenda, then using or abusing their power, they just go for policy design. And we call it legislative fixation. How can you do this? You issue a law, of course, a new road safety code, even tougher than the first one. And you say you have the same results on the road. This is legislative fixation, and then it is followed by administrative fixation. Administrative fixation, of course, that if you issue a law, it has to be somebody to implement it. So you throw the law to your deconcentrated structures, to schools, to inspectorates, to whatever you have, and you say, now it's your turn, you know. This is not policy making. And you also skip evaluation. You don't care about evaluation. Most of the time, NGOs do that in our countries. There is no obligation for policymakers to evaluate impact of their policies. I've heard that in Canada, one time, one prime minister had to resign because of a policy evaluation report. I don't know about you, but I don't want to go to that line process. It's getting back to the legacy, you know? We are obsessed with the idea of solutions, you know? And if you look to this policy cycle from another perspective, then you have here choice of strategic solution, and you have here implementing the solution, solution. Actually, this obsession for solution, it is one of the reasons for which they go from the cycle to the line. Because a problem appears, and they say, we have to act now, we have to act immediately. But actually, what is going on, they don't understand the problem, and this is why policies are failing. You know, because most of the time, when a policy fails, it happens not because of the wrong solution to the problem, but because of the wrong understanding of the problem. Ignoring research, ignoring data, not allowing time for analysis, and so on and so forth. You know, problems and gaps like this are the same, but ours, in our part of the world, are a little bit bigger. And we always have to jump higher. We always have to rush, and central governments are using this to abuse power tools, to neglect democratic processes, and to act in an effective way and find a good excuse for that. To stay comfortably on the tip of the iceberg and not have the courage to look underwater. There are not really good circumstances for us to influence policymaking in Central and Eastern Europe. And I believe that it is also the case in other parts of the world. Managing research is usually hard because of the weak capacity to absorb and implement research at the decision-making and policy levels, scarcity of resources, low stability of the institutions, and maybe more important than the others, low interest to go for this Blockstein's invitation on how to lose your political virginity while keeping your scientific credibility. People in our world, in the researchers and analyst world, they believe that if they get into these messy processes, they will lose their credibility. But I believe that in spite of all these games dominated by string pullers, interest groups, favors, disrespect for science and legitimacy, that's a need to get involved in the game, because if we leave them alone, they will act accordingly. There are a few things that we can do, I believe. And one thing is to look for cracks, for windows. It's not that everything is lost. You can find windows, how Kingdom call it. You can find sometimes progressive and educated decision makers who are really interested to look into the evidences, to discuss with specialists, to consult with stakeholders, and so on and so forth. Sometimes you find pressure from international community, and you can use that in order to crack the system. Then I believe that we have to look at ourselves and to keep improving methodological apparatus and keep nurturing policy-relevant research and strong research communities to approach the inner fabric of the changes, the profound process changes, and not those structural games that the governance is playing at this moment for more than 30 years now with very limited or no results. We have to denounce this mixing metaphors technique that they use to cover poor capacity or authoritarianism and induce confusion to stakeholders. They put together things that they are not linked in order to create confusion. They launch into the public debate intentionally topics that are not important. For instance, a few years ago, they launched the debate, is it better to start school at 6 or at 7? And you know, everyone in the country was discussing about this. And we said, okay, guys, stop. this is not relevant. This is not the thing, you know. This is not improving anything if we don't look to the processes. And yes, I do believe that we have to go for Blockstein advice, engage in the messy two-way process of communication and discussion of policy-relevant data. We have to admit that sometimes it's good to lose our political virginity while keeping our scientific credibility. Because if we don't lose just the chance for better policy making in education. But I believe that we lose the chance to keep education as a process and educational systems as pillars of democracy. Because at least in our countries, education and educational systems, they were and they are still pillars of democracy. And here, what I'm saying, and I said it in the beginning of my speech, we are facing a new type of authoritarianism being born in Central and Eastern Europe and beyond. Is insidious, because it is not in the face, as it was the case of communism, is more subtle, is masked by all these crises, COVID, war, economic turmoil, and so on. And as again, somebody said it yesterday, we have to stay vigilant to improve policy, because actually, if we, academics, if we don't engage in this, we cannot safeguard democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucian. We have some time for questions, and we have the roving mics. We'll start at the front here.
Thank you. Thank you for a very wide panoramic view of what is going on in terms of policy making and participation in that process. I hope you won't mind me saying to you that from the perspective I'm looking at, your analysis is ahistorical. I tell you why. Because the main reference point for you is the end of the Soviet influence. But then the model you have in front of you, where you might want to go, needs to be looked at from a historical perspective. So if you look at the UK, the so-called democracy we live in was built on colonialism and slavery. You look at the USA, which claims to be democratic, and you'll see there a huge way that people are neglected. So what's your model in terms of moving from what it was when you were a child, a student, to where you want to go? Is there a historical kind of instruction or advice you can gain from? Sorry about a long question.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. Although I insisted here on that historical point of, finishing with the communist regimes, because it is really important for that part of the world. I think that, to answer your question, when you start building democracy, you don't, at least this is my perception, you don't take a model which has a name of a country or the name of many countries. I think that when you start building democracy, you're building on the inner values of the process itself and how different countries understand or understood in the past To implement democracy, as you have mentioned, in the UK and the US, that's another story. I don't feel that we need, again, one model. We need policy learning for sure. We need to learn for the best or for the good practices or from the relevant practices in any democratic country of the world. But I believe that what is here at stake are the basic values of democracy and how you perceive it and how you transfer those in professional processes like educational policy making. I'm not saying that we have to jump from the one line that I was showing there, communist type or authoritarian type of approach, to the Westminster model of policy making. I didn't say that. But what I'm saying is that, in my view, public policy in general, educational policy making in particular, at least in our countries, they are part of the effort to maintain democracy. And when it's at risk, we don't have to look only to the technical issues of the process, what works or what doesn't work in terms of technicalities, but we have to look to the broader picture and understand that what I'm saying here is the attachment for the core values of democracy.
And there was another question in the middle here.
Thank you. Very interesting. I think the historical part also was interesting too in terms of that transition. I wonder also, maybe looking from that different political landscape, what do you see to be the role, of workers' associations? I'm asking this because right now the main University and Student Union and the National Education Union are balloting for strike, and I am part of that. And for me, my political activism is a lot about restoring that feedback loop. I see that here it's the only way that we have to send a message to policymakers that can be actioned in some way, because otherwise we don't have much. But I know there are risks of ideologization and excessive politicization. So I wanted to hear your perspective about that.
You know, I believe that strike is a policy tool. It's probably somewhere to the end of the continuum of different tools that you can use, but it's still a policy tool. And I think that sometimes when you want to make a statement, you can use also this because they are available. I believe that, in the policy processes, at least in our case, we assisted over the last years to a consolidation of different kinds of stakeholders, including unions, of students, unions of different kinds. Consolidation of the non-profit sector, which has always a voice, which acted as a kind of watchdog to the authorities and so on. But in the last few years, and this worries me, weakening of these democratic processes came with weakening of the role of all these stakeholders. I see less and less voice coming from the NGO sector. I see less and less independent action of unions, and so on and so forth. This is what I'm saying, that it's a vicious circle here. I don't know if it answers your question, it's just my perspective. Thank you very much.
Our time is up, I'm afraid. If you didn't get your question asked, I'm really sorry. Can I thank you again, Lucian? I think it's really helpful for us to think about, and I can see nodding heads, I think it's really helpful for us working across the 4 nations in the UK to look at our own policy process making and where we're going, even this week with the new government, through the lens of the Romanian experience. So I think that's been really helpful. And I would imagine that conversations might continue over lunch about this. So can you please put your hands together again and thank Lucian.